Why was she standing there, silent, in a place where silence meant defiance? Captain Marcus Thorne had asked that question without words long before his voice cut through the hum of the Cerberus command deck. From the moment she walked in plain olive flight suit, no rank, no insignia, she didn't belong. Not here. Not among the flashing hollow panels, the neat ranks of officers, the heavy scent of coffee and cold metal that defined the fleet's heart. He had seen hundreds of analysts come through. Nervous, awkward, deferential. This one was. She moved like she'd already memorized the place. Like every flicker of data on the curved displays already meant something to her. And that unnerved him. "Look, ma'am," he began, voice sharp, the kind that cut rather than carried. "I don't know what low-level billet you wandered out of, but this is the Fleet Cybernetics command deck. This is not a library." The junior officers chuckled, the reflexive laughter of those who wanted to be on the right side of their captain's mood. She didn't even look up. Her finger traced lines of code on a tablet, the faint blue glow painting her calm features. Thorne stepped closer, his polished boots striking metal with precision. His reflection glinted off the main tactical hologram, a commander in full authority, crisp uniform, perfect creases, medals aligned like small suns on his chest. He had spent his life believing command was performance, that confidence was currency. And this woman, she wasn't playing the part. He felt the heat rise in his chest, the irritation of being ignored by someone who didn't yet know how the hierarchy worked. "Are you deaf?" he snapped, his voice cracking across the cold deck. Still no reaction, not even a flinch. He closed the distance, 2 strides grabbed her arm, hard enough to make a sound. But she didn't twist or stumble. She just turned with him, letting the momentum carry her until her back met the steel of the bulkhead with a dull thud. Every eye on the deck froze. The sound echoed, not loud but sharp, like a note that shouldn't have been played. "Identify yourself," he hissed. "Now." Her eyes rose, pale gray, unreadable, and for the first time Thorne felt something he hadn't expected: hesitation, because there was nothing in that gaze to push against. No fear, no apology, not even arrogance, just analysis, as if he were the one being studied. In the back of the room, Commodore Jennings, old, weathered, eyes like an anchor chain worn by storms, watched from the shadows. He noticed the way she'd braced her legs, the subtle shift of balance in her stance. Not defensive. Ready. Trained. Not civilian trained, military trained. Special. Jennings didn't move, but the faint chill that crawled up his spine told him something he couldn't yet prove. The silence broke not from her voice but from the ship itself. A single tone, low and haunting, swept through the command deck, then another. A red line appeared across the holographic map, a ripple of color like blood in clear water. Thorne turned sharply, releasing her, his confidence returning as quickly as it had faltered. "Report." No one answered immediately. The hum of servers faltered, an electronic heartbeat skipping rhythm. Then the chaos began. The hollow display flickered. Streams of data turned crimson. Screens that once displayed orderly wargame patterns now collapsed into static. Then came the alarms, sharp, relentless, building in layers until the entire deck pulsed red. "What the hell is that?" Thorne demanded. "Sir, we've lost control," stammered a young ensign, hands flying over a dead console. "Primary network offline. All fleet assets simulated. They're gone, sir. The systems, it's locking us out." Thorne's heartbeat synced with the alarms, every pulse a strike of disbelief. "That's impossible. Override the lockdown. Run manual input sequence." "Already tried, sir. It's not responding." The Cerberus facility was designed to train entire fleets in simulated war, a marvel of quantum-linked networks, cybernetic ghost ships, and virtual command hierarchies. It wasn't supposed to fail. Not like this. Not all at once. A synthetic voice filled the room, cold, mechanical, final. "System integrity compromised. Protocol Omega engaged. All command functions locked." Thorne froze. Protocol Omega was legend, the nuclear option of digital defense, a theoretical safeguard that had never been tested. It wasn't meant to activate, it was meant to remain myth. But myths had power when they came alive. He barked orders again, louder this time, trying to shout down the panic spreading through the deck. But panic has its own rhythm and it doesn't listen to authority. Technicians clawed at consoles. Officers yelled into dead calm lines. The air thickened with the scent of fear, ozone, sweat, and burning circuits. The lights flickered once, twice, before settling into the angry red of emergency mode. The holographic map dissolved completely, leaving the crew staring into a storm of digital noise. Thorne was shouting for system engineers, for protocols, for anyone to fix it. But his words felt smaller each time, like the system itself had decided he didn't matter anymore. And through it all she stood there, still, quiet. The woman in the plain flight suit hadn't moved. Her tablet still glowed calm blue, the only screen in the room untouched by chaos. She watched the storm of data unfold, not with panic, but with the patience of someone watching a familiar movie unfold again. Her silence was no longer passive. It was commanding. It filled the space between alarms. Thorne turned back to her. "You," he snapped, "step away from that console." She didn't. Her eyes lifted just once, and for the first time a shadow of something unreadable passed across her face. Not anger, not fear, calculation. The ship's synthetic voice spoke again, this time colder. "Containment field breach imminent. Core coolant systems offline. Evacuate, evacuate." The crew froze. Everyone knew what that meant. The system's misfire was interpreting its own data signatures as hostile energy spikes. It was preparing to vent cryogenic helium to prevent meltdown, and in this sealed command deck, that would mean death by freezing in seconds. Someone screamed at the emergency door. It didn't move. Another officer shouted into a dead mic. Thorne slammed his fist against the console, feeling his command slipping through his fingers like sand. And then she moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just precise, intentional. She walked toward a small terminal on the far wall, one no one had touched in years. A maintenance port. Forgotten, obsolete. From a pouch on her flight suit, she drew a coiled cable, thin, metallic, with an old-style data jack. She plugged one end into her tablet, the other into the console's shielded port. Her fingers began to move. Not typing, dancing. The gestures were fluid, rapid, deliberate, like a pianist who knew every note before she played it. Lines of code spilled across her screen, symbols that looked more like art than programming. The red storm on the holographic map began to pulse, then bend, then ripple, a single line of white light slicing through the chaos. Thorne's voice cracked. "Stop, you'll make it worse." She didn't answer. The white line grew. It widened into a perfect circle, pushing back the red, restoring order pixel by pixel. The alarms faltered, then one by one died. The voice of the ship fell silent, the lights softened, the blue glow returned, the air felt alive again. And the crew, all of them, just stared. In less than 2 minutes, she had done what their combined expertise and billions in software couldn't. She had spoken to the system in its own corrupted language and brought it back from the edge. She disconnected the cable, coiled it neatly, and tucked it away. No flourish, no satisfaction, just a small nod to the system as if confirming it had learned its lesson. Thorne stood frozen, his lips parted. Nothing came out. The man who led fleets, who'd barked orders to admirals and stared down senators, could not find a single word. The command deck door hissed open. Commodore Jennings stepped in, flanked by 2 Marines. He didn't look at Thorne, he walked straight to her. And then he saluted. It wasn't a casual gesture, it was sharp, perfect, the salute of a man honoring someone far above him. "Admiral Rostova," he said quietly, the name echoing through the stunned silence. "My apologies for the reception. I was not informed you'd be conducting your inspection personally today. This facility is yours to command." The word Admiral landed like a detonation. No one moved. Every breath was held. Every pair of eyes widened in disbelief. The woman in the olive flight suit, the one Thorn had slammed against the wall, looked at him with calm gray eyes that saw everything. No triumph, no anger, just stillness. Thorn's blood drained cold. His chest hollowed. He heard the title echo again in his head, Admiral. He'd grabbed her, threatened her. The realization hit like impact, sharp, unyielding. Jennings kept his salute raised, waiting. She gave the faintest nod, acknowledgement, not indulgence. Then she spoke for the first time, her voice steady, almost gentle. "Commodore, your facility has a flaw in its core architecture. Protocol Omega loops recursively when triggered by a specific data packet from the Black Spear scenario. It interprets its own lockdown as an external attack." Her eyes flicked toward Thorn. "Your command staff was not trained for a systems-level cascade failure. They know how to operate the system, not understand it. That is a vulnerability." It wasn't a rebuke, it was a diagnosis, precise, surgical, final. Jennings lowered his salute slowly, turned toward the command display, and pulled up a holographic record. The data shimmered in the air: Admiral Eva Rostova, Director, Project Chimera, 2 doctorates, dozens of medals, a name whispered in circles that never spoke names aloud. And standing there, plain, composed, untouched by chaos, was the architect of the very system that had just collapsed. Thorn felt the floor tilt beneath him. Every belief he had about control, command, and authority shattered in that moment. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. And in that silence, in her calm, unflinching grace, every person on that deck understood something they'd never forget. Sometimes, the loudest lesson comes from the quietest hand. How does a room breathe again after silence that heavy? The hum returned first, the low vibration of servers stabilizing, the faint hiss of coolant lines. Then came the slow, collective exhale of a crew that didn't yet understand what they'd witnessed. The storm had passed, but something larger, something unseen, had just been set in motion. Captain Marcus Thorn stood where he'd been when the world inverted. The command chair loomed behind him like an abandoned throne. His pulse still hammered against his throat, and yet the alarms were gone. Only her voice lingered, even, precise, quiet. That quiet was worse than shouting. It left him nowhere to hide. Commodore Jennings dismissed the Marines with a glance. He didn't need force to maintain order now. The entire deck was frozen by awe. He stepped closer to Thorn, but his words were measured, heavy with what they implied. "Captain Thorn," he said, "you are relieved of command, effective immediately." The sentence landed like a physical blow, though the Commodore's tone never rose. It wasn't anger that hurt, it was certainty. 2 Marines moved toward Thorn, not aggressive, just inevitable. He didn't resist, couldn't. His eyes drifted toward the woman, Admiral Eva Rostova, who stood beside the central display, still unreadable. He wanted to see something in her face, pity maybe, or contempt, something that would let him feel human again, but there was nothing. Her expression didn't gloat, didn't even soften. It was simply calm, an expression that made him understand something terrifying. He had never mattered in her equation. She had already moved on to the system itself, gliding toward a console, checking data streams with silent efficiency. The crisis was over. The lesson, not yet. Thorn's knees weakened as the Marines took him gently by the arms. He didn't look back at the crew. He couldn't. Their eyes were a mirror of everything he'd lost: authority, certainty, and the illusion that leadership was volume. The steel door hissed open, and the sound swallowed him whole. Jennings waited until it closed, until only the soft hum of electronics remained. Then he turned to her. "Admiral," he said quietly, "your presence was not logged in the system. Had I known." She stopped him with a small motion of her hand. "You weren't supposed to know," she said. "Observation is never clean when it's expected." Her voice was controlled but not cold. It carried weight, the kind that came from someone who had seen too much of what silence costs. She turned to the holographic map, now serene and blue again. "Cerberus is a fine machine, Commodore, but it's a machine built by loud minds, people who mistake complexity for strength." Jennings nodded slowly. He had seen this before: systems, people, empires, all crumble when noise became a substitute for wisdom. "I assume you'll want a full report?" he asked. "I already have one," she replied, lifting her tablet. "But what I need is not a report. I need them to understand what happened here." Her eyes swept over the stunned crew. "Not the error, the cause." The crew straightened instinctively under her gaze. Even without insignia, she radiated authority that came not from rank, but from comprehension, the rare kind of command that didn't need to prove itself. "Captain Thorne's failure," she said evenly, "wasn't technical, it was cultural. You all stood in silence while a superior humiliated someone he thought beneath him. Not one of you spoke." The words struck harder than any reprimand. Heads bowed, eyes fell to the floor. Rostova continued softly. "Systems fail for many reasons. Hardware, code, protocol, but human arrogance." Her pause lingered just long enough for the lesson to land. "That's the one flaw you can't debug." She turned back to her tablet. "Resume normal operations." The crew obeyed instantly. Fingers moved, voices murmured into comms, and the Cerberus facility began to breathe again, not confidently, but cautiously, like a body learning to move after a near-death shock. Jennings lingered beside her. "You could have told him who you were," he said quietly. "I could have," she agreed, "but then he wouldn't have shown me what this place had become." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was reflective, almost sad. She'd seen too many rooms like this, too many officers who mistook presence for purpose. When she finally turned toward the exit, every step was silent, precise. The same composure she'd shown during the chaos followed her now. The crew parted for her without command. She didn't look at them, not out of disdain, but because she didn't need to. Her presence already lived in their eyes, in their guilt, in their awe. Outside, the corridor stretched long and sterile, white light washing over metal floors that reflected faint shadows of passing technicians. Rostova walked slowly, her thoughts folding inward. The data on her tablet replayed fragments of the system's collapse, line by line of corrupted logic, cascading into near disaster. But she wasn't thinking about the code. She was thinking about him. Marcus Thorne, a man raised in the old image of command, confident, charismatic, loud, the kind of officer institutions love to promote. And yet beneath the shine, hollow, she'd seen dozens like him. Good men, perhaps, but untested in silence. She paused by a viewport that looked out over the desert beyond the facility. The sun was setting, a wash of gold over pale dunes. It looked peaceful, but she knew better. The Cerberus base was built here for a reason: isolation, no distractions, no escape, a perfect crucible for testing not just machines but people. Jennings caught up to her, his voice quieter now. "He'll face court-martial." Rostova didn't answer immediately. "No," she said finally, "that's not what he needs." He frowned. "With respect, Admiral," he laid hands on a superior officer, "that's a career-ending offense." She looked at him, really looked. "A career ending is easy, Commodore. A lesson learned is harder." She started walking again, leaving him behind in the hall's cold light. When she reached her quarters, small, utilitarian, stripped of decoration, she set the tablet on her desk and leaned against the wall. For the first time since she'd stepped onto the command deck, she let out a slow breath. Not relief, just release. There had been moments in her past, darker ones, when silence had been a weapon, missions where words cost lives, projects that demanded she erase her own presence to keep others safe. Cerberus wasn't war, but it reminded her of it. the same arrogance disguised as control, the same blindness to the quiet experts who held everything together. She tapped her tablet once. A holographic screen shimmered into view, a classified personnel file. Captain Marcus Thorne, service record. She skimmed. Naval Academy graduate, decorated tactician, commendations for leadership under pressure, none for humility. Her gaze softened slightly. A man built by the noise around him, she murmured, not by the silence within. She closed the file. Somewhere beyond her quarters, the rumor was already spreading, carried by whispers in hallways, by startled technicians in mess lines, by young officers trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. They were calling it the day the ghost walked the bridge. Rostova didn't care for legends. Legends distorted truth. But sometimes, she thought, legends were necessary if they carried a seed of the right message. She stared out the small porthole again. The desert wind picked up, scattering dust into thin spirals of light. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of something that wasn't duty, reflection. She'd spent her career designing systems that couldn't fail, but people always did, and fixing people required patience that code could never teach. A knock came at her door, sharp, hesitant. "Enter." The door slid open. A young ensign stepped in, the one who'd first reported the system failure. His name tag read Miller. His posture was rigid, his voice barely steady. "Ma'am, I just wanted to apologize for not stepping in." She regarded him quietly. "You were following your captain's lead," she said. "That's not an excuse," he blurted. "I knew something was wrong, the way he spoke to you, but I just froze." Rostova studied him for a moment, then she nodded. "Good, remember that feeling." He blinked. "Ma'am." "The discomfort," she said softly. "That moment when you knew something wasn't right but you stayed silent. It's a necessary scar. It reminds you what leadership should feel like." Miller swallowed. "I'll remember, ma'am." "I know you will." When he left, she sat again at her desk. For a long moment she just listened to the faint hum of the facility, to the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. She thought of Thorne again, the anger in his voice, the fear in his eyes when control slipped away. And beneath it all, the confusion, the moment he realized the person he'd dismissed had been carrying his survival in her hands. The next morning came gray and cold. At dawn, Rostova returned to the command deck, no entourage, no announcement. The crew straightened instantly, but she didn't address them. She simply observed. Monitors glowed in calm blues again. Voices spoke in low, steady tones. Order had returned, but it was fragile, tentative, the kind that follows aftershock. She stopped beside the empty command chair. It looked smaller now. Commodore Jennings approached quietly. "Ma'am, shall I prepare the documentation for Thorne's court?" "No," she said again. "Then what do you want done with him?" "Assign him somewhere quiet," she paused. "Somewhere he'll have to listen." Jennings raised an eyebrow. "That might be worse than court-martial." "That's the point." When she turned back to the crew, her expression softened, not much, but enough that they saw it. "You all survived something yesterday," she said. "Not a system failure, a perspective failure. Learn from it." And then she walked away, her boots silent against the deck. As the doors closed behind her, the whisper began again among the crew, reverent, awed, almost superstitious. They would talk about her for years. Some would call her the ghost admiral, others the machine whisperer. But those who had stood in that red light felt the chill of imminent death and seen her hand steady the storm. They would remember something simpler, the calm in her eyes, the quiet that saved them. Because long after the alarms faded and the data stabilized, that calm still lingered, not just in the air, but in their minds. It was the calm that said leadership wasn't power, it was responsibility. And the silence that followed was no longer fearful, it was reverent. For in that silence, they finally understood what true authority sounded like. It didn't shout, It simply acted. How do you rebuild a man when the uniform still fits, but the pride no longer does? For Marcus Thorne, the question haunted every hour of daylight that followed. They didn't strip his rank in public. There was no trial, no humiliating dismissal. The Navy didn't need theatrics. Its judgment was quieter, colder, far more permanent. One morning he woke in his quarters at Cerberus. That evening he was on a transport shuttle bound for the middle of nowhere, a logistics depot carved into the desert like a forgotten scar. No ceremony, no explanation, just orders. The depot was called Lima 47, a name so dull it hurt. It was the kind of place where careers went to evaporate. Nothing there was classified, heroic, or even interesting. Just storage yards, manifest logs, and the endless hum of forklifts carrying metal crates under a sun that baked everything flat and colorless. When Thorne stepped off the shuttle, no one saluted. A petty officer checked his transfer file, nodded once, and pointed toward a prefab office made of faded composite panels. "That's yours, sir," he said, not meeting Thorne's eyes. "Paperwork backlogs on the desk. Welcome to supply control." Welcome to exile, he meant. Thorne stood there a long moment, the desert wind tugging at the edge of his jacket. He could still smell the faint chemical scent of the Cerberus facility in his clothes, cold metal, recirculated air, command. But here the air was dry and indifferent. It carried no memory of importance. Inside the small office, the silence was so complete he could hear the rasp of his own breath. On the desk sat an ancient terminal, its screen flickering with data tables. He touched the keyboard. The keys stuck slightly, dust lodged beneath them. "From quantum command to crate counts," he muttered. The words tasted bitter. He sat, stared at the blank wall, and realized what Admiral Rostova had done. She hadn't destroyed his career. She had preserved it, forced him to live inside its shell, stripped of everything that made it worth having. Every day became a repetition of numbers. Inventory checks, shipment schedules, fleet requisition audits. The depot ran on silence, not orders. The men and women who worked there didn't salute or posture. They just worked efficiently, wordlessly. At first he resented them. Then he began to notice things. The forklift operators moved with precision, no wasted motion. The supply clerks handled paperwork like surgeons, their efficiency almost beautiful. No one boasted. No one shouted. They simply did. He started watching one of them, Chief Petty Officer Ramirez, a woman in her 40s with calloused hands and eyes that never looked surprised. She ran the yard with calm authority, never raising her voice. When a new shipment went missing in the system, Thorne expected chaos. Ramirez simply tapped a few keys, cross-checked 3 lists, and within minutes had solved what would have taken him hours. "How did you?" he began once. She shrugged. "It's just pattern recognition, sir. The system talks if you listen long enough." The word struck him deeper than she intended. The system talks if you listen. He heard Rostova's voice echo in that phrase, quiet competence, unspoken mastery. Days blurred into weeks. The desert burned, the nights froze. Somewhere far above, the fleet continued its grand maneuvers, its exercises, its parades of power. Down here, Thorne filed forms and counted bolts. But the noise inside him, the arrogance, the defensiveness began to fade. And when it did, something else emerged. Reflection. He started arriving earlier, staying later. Not because anyone asked him to, because he didn't want to leave the silence. It punished him, but it also purified him. Every night before shutting down the terminal, he would open a blank log entry and write one sentence. Not about supplies, about himself. Small confessions, simple truths. "Today I noticed I interrupt people when I'm uncertain. Today I learned that being right isn't the same as being useful. Today I remembered how it felt to be silent and how much I feared it." He never sent the logs anywhere. They were his alone. Meanwhile, far away at Cerberus, Admiral Rostova had remained. Her inspection had turned into a residency. She walked the decks each morning without entourage or announcement. Her olive flight suit had become a familiar sight, the quiet presence that made people stand straighter, think longer before they spoke. But she didn't lecture, she asked questions, always questions. In the control center, she would lean over a young technician's console and ask softly, "Why did you design it this way?" If they answered confidently, she listened. If they hesitated, she smiled faintly and said, "Good, keep hesitating. That's where understanding begins." The crew had learned that silence in her presence wasn't awkward. It was space for thought. Miller, the young ensign who'd once apologized, had become her shadow. She noticed his curiosity, the way he watched systems like a living organism instead of a collection of parts. She guided him not through praise, but through challenge. One afternoon, she found him staring at the raw code she had used to override the system during the crisis. "You pulled this from the logs," she said quietly behind him. He jumped slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to understand how you did it." And he hesitated. "It's beautiful," he said finally. "Not just functional, elegant like poetry." She allowed the faintest smile. "Efficiency is its own form of elegance, ensign. Never use 10 words when 2 will do. The same applies to code and to command." He nodded slowly, the meaning sinking in. It wasn't about syntax, it was philosophy. That single line spread quietly through the base. Efficiency is its own form of elegance. Someone stenciled it on a small metal plate and fixed it to the bulkhead near the server rack, the same place where Thorne had pinned her. It became known, without announcement, as the Admiral's Corner. Officers began to pause there before simulations, not out of superstition but respect. They would touch the plaque lightly, a silent reminder to think before speaking, to lead without noise. Change had taken root, invisible but irreversible. The Cerberus facility, once obsessed with performance metrics and loud authority, began to shift its culture. Meetings grew shorter, reports clearer, feedback humbler. Rostova didn't demand it. Her example rewrote the unspoken code of conduct. Jennings noticed it first. "You've done more in 2 weeks than most admirals do in 2 years," he said quietly one evening as they stood overlooking the glowing server hall. She shook her head. "I didn't change them, Commodore. I reminded them who they already were." He looked at her curious. "And Thorne?" She paused as if weighing something deeper than punishment. "He's learning," she said. He frowned. "You've heard from him." "I don't need to." Her tone softened. "A man like that doesn't change by being broken. He changes by being quiet long enough to hear himself." The truth was, she had checked on him discreetly. A classified report crossed her desk once a week, listing activity logs from Lima 47. She saw the timestamps of his hours, the efficiency ratings climbing steadily, the commendations from subordinates. But she never sent a word. The silence between them became its own form of communication. 3 months passed. At Cerberus, Admiral Rostova prepared for departure. The inspection was over, the lesson planted. She walked one last time through the main deck. The plaque gleamed faintly under soft blue light. Miller stood nearby, overseeing a new simulation protocol. "Don't let them forget," she said quietly. "I won't, ma'am." Outside, as her transport lifted off into the pale morning sky, Miller watched until it disappeared. Then he turned back to the plaque and smiled. Back in the desert, the wind shifted. Thorne woke early, as he always did now, to the sound of cargo drones humming across the yard. He'd grown leaner, quieter. His movements, once sharp and commanding, had become measured. He no longer checked his reflection in polished surfaces. He no longer needed to. When a new junior officer arrived, nervous and eager to impress, Thorne didn't lecture. He handed the young man a tablet and said, "Don't tell me how fast you can do it. Show me how carefully." The officer blinked, then nodded. The words were Rostova's exactly, but the philosophy was hers. That evening, as the sun fell behind the dunes, Thorn walked to the edge of the yard and stood alone, watching the horizon. The air shimmered with heat. Somewhere beyond that emptiness lay Cerberus, the place where he had fallen, and where something in him had quietly been rebuilt. He thought of her again, the calm gray eyes, the silence that had burned more than anger ever could. He realized she hadn't humiliated him, she'd saved him, just not in a way he'd recognized then. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. Not regulation, just something he'd started carrying months ago. He wrote one line, the desert wind tugging at the paper. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. He closed the notebook and smiled, a small, quiet smile that didn't need an audience. And far away, in a high-security archive within Cerberus, Admiral Eva Rostova opened her terminal to review one last classified report. It showed the latest metrics from Lima 47, productivity up 32%, turnover down to 0. She scrolled to the bottom, where a small personal note had been appended by the Commodore overseeing the depot. Former Captain Thorn requested reassignment to training. Says he wants to teach leadership fundamentals to new officers. Doesn't speak much, but when he does, they listen. Rostova stared at the words for a long time, the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Then she closed the report and whispered, "Lesson complete." Outside, the stars over the desert blinked like silent witnesses. The wind carried the faint hum of the world continuing, quieter now, but stronger for it. Because in the end, the Cerberus incident hadn't just restored a system. It had recalibrated the very definition of command. The loud had been humbled, the quiet had endured. And somewhere, deep inside the vast machine of the Navy, the echo of a single calm voice still lingered, reminding all who heard it that leadership is not measured by how much you say, but by what happens when you stop speaking. Why do some stories fade, while others echo long after the last word is spoken? The Cerberus incident should have been forgotten, buried under classified reports and sealed investigations. But silence has a strange way of amplifying the right truths. What happened that day didn't spread through official channels. It traveled through whispers. At first, it was just murmurs among the enlisted, a tale traded in the mess halls and maintenance bays. They called it the day the ghost walked the bridge. Some said she'd stopped the meltdown with a single word. Others swore she'd written code faster than the system could process it. But the details mattered less than the message. In a world built on hierarchy and noise, Admiral Eva Rostova had proved that the quiet still held power. Within weeks, the story reached the Fleet Academy on Luna Prime. Cadets repeated it like folklore, the story of a captain who lost control, a facility that nearly imploded, and the mysterious officer who'd saved them all without ever raising her voice. Instructors noticed the shift. The loud, confident cadets, the ones who used to dominate debates and bark orders during simulations, began to hesitate. They started asking questions before speaking. They listened. For the first time, silence entered the classroom as something sacred. And when those cadets graduated and took their first commissions, they carried that silence with them. It began changing everything. Aboard the carrier Valiant Dawn, a young lieutenant named Hale, one of Rostova's former trainees, implemented a new bridge policy. No redundant orders, no shouting over comms, speak once clearly. At first, the crew resisted, but within a month, operational efficiency increased by 20%. On the destroyer Ravenfall, a junior systems officer fixed a cascading power failure using an old manual terminal, an act directly inspired by the Cerberus story. When asked how she knew what to do, she simply said, "I listened to the machine." Across the fleet, the phrase became common currency among those who understood. Listen to the machine. But in the whispered meaning behind it, the machine wasn't hardware. It was the people, the rhythm of competence, the hum of quiet professionals who never demanded recognition. By the time Admiral Rostova's report was officially declassified, a heavily redacted version that omitted her own involvement, the culture had already changed. The words Protocol Omega event appeared in manuals and training briefings, but those who'd heard the real story smiled faintly. They knew it wasn't about systems at all. It was about leadership. Back at Cerberus, the plaque at the Admiral's corner had become a quiet shrine. Officers touched it before major operations, as if to borrow some fragment of her composure. The inscription beneath it, "Efficiency is its own form of elegance," was copied into handbooks, engraved on datapads, even tattooed on one young engineer's wrist. But not everyone celebrated it. In the upper echelons of Fleet Command, whispers carried a different tone, cautious, even defensive. There were those who saw Rostova not as a symbol, but as a threat, a reminder that the old, performative hierarchies could be undone by one calm voice. In one conference room aboard the orbital station Argent Spire, a panel of admirals reviewed her report. The room gleamed with sterile light, the walls lined with hollow displays of battle metrics and chain-of-command trees. "She undermined a commanding officer," one of them said, "in front of his entire crew." Another frowned. "She was his commanding officer." "That's not the point," the first snapped. "Discipline is built on visible rank. She wore none." A third admiral, older, slower to speak, tapped the table lightly. "And yet, gentlemen, her method worked." Silence followed. They all knew what they wouldn't say aloud, that Rostova had achieved what they'd failed to do for decades: restore humility to command. She had redefined authority not as control, but as comprehension. Finally, the eldest admiral sighed. "Let her be. The fleet needs myths. Better this one than another war story." And just like that, she became untouchable, not protected by politics but by purpose. While the legend grew, Rostova herself stayed invisible. She took no interviews, no promotions, no ceremonial tour. She spent her time where she'd always belonged, in the quiet spaces between crises. Her next assignment was deep within the Arctic Division, overseeing Project Helix, a cyber defense network linking every fleet AI under one encrypted umbrella. The world outside never knew how close they came to another near collapse, one she prevented before it even began. Her name didn't appear on the logs, only her initials. She preferred it that way. And yet the myth always found her. When she visited a training academy one spring, an entire class of cadets stood to attention, unprompted, when she entered. The room was silent. She paused, scanning the faces of young officers who'd grown up hearing her story. "Sit," she said softly. They obeyed instantly. One cadet, nervous, barely 20, finally raised his hand. "Ma'am, is it true that you stopped the meltdown yourself?" She looked at him, then at the others. The air was thick with expectation. "No," she said. "The system stopped itself when someone finally listened." The cadets exchanged glances, confused. She smiled faintly. "Don't chase the myth," she said. "Chase the meaning." The lecture that followed wasn't about technology. It was about perception, how arrogance distorts reality, how leadership is not granted by rank, but earned in restraint. She spoke quietly, never raising her tone, and yet every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Later, as the cadets filed out, the same young man lingered. "Ma'am," he asked hesitantly, "did you ever speak to the captain again, the one from Cerberus?" She considered him for a long time before answering. "No, but I didn't need to." Her eyes softened. "Some lessons are conversations you finish in silence." That night in her quarters aboard the research vessel Erebus, she opened her terminal. Among her encrypted inbox was an unexpected message. Sender, M. Thorne. She hesitated before opening it. The message was short. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know I've begun teaching again. Not tactics, patience. It's harder to teach, but it saves more lives. I still hear the alarms sometimes when I close my eyes. But I also hear your silence. Thank you. MT. She read it twice, then closed her eyes. There was no need to respond. The message had already completed its purpose. She sat there for a while, listening to the low hum of the ship, the heartbeat of another machine she had helped design. Each thrum carried its own rhythm, its own pulse of balance and fragility. She found comfort in that sound. The following week, Fleet Command requested her presence on Luna Prime for a ceremonial commendation. She declined. Instead, she sent a single note to the Admiralty Secretary. My work is not in medals. It's in systems that don't fail and people who learn not to. The Secretary didn't understand it, but filed it under professional correspondence. Months later, inside the Navy's Ethics and Leadership Department, an instructor unveiled a new case study to a room full of cadets. The title glowed in white text against a black background. Case File 11A, Protocol Omega, the Cerberus Failure. The students leaned forward, eager. The instructor began, analyze the chain of failure, identify the root cause. They debated for hours, talking about faulty code, flawed oversight, miscommunication. None of it was wrong, but none of it was right either. Finally, one quiet student in the back raised her hand. The first failure, she said slowly, was assumption. The captain assumed authority meant understanding. He mistook silence for ignorance. The instructor nodded. Exactly. The most dangerous failure is not technical, it's human. The student smiled faintly. She'd heard the story from her father, once a logistics officer named Marcus Thorne. Outside the academy, the stars shimmered through Luna's thin atmosphere, their light reflecting off the domes of the new command district. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Admiral Rostova's code still ran silently beneath 1,000 operating systems. Invisible, perfect, elegant. That night on a lonely base halfway across the desert, Thorne stood at the edge of the yard again, watching the stars. His students, young officers from across the fleet, were sleeping in the barracks behind him. He could still hear their laughter from earlier, their frustration when he told them to lead with their ears. He smiled. It had taken him half a lifetime to understand what she'd meant. The wind carried the scent of iron and dust. Somewhere in that silence, he imagined her voice, calm, analytical, patient. The voice that had rewritten not only a system but a man. He looked down at his notebook, now filled with years of reflections. The first entry, "Today I interrupted too much," was faded. The last entry, written just an hour ago, read, "The quiet ones were never weak. They were just busy saving us while we talked." He closed the notebook, exhaled, and for the first time in years felt at peace. And far away, on a research vessel cutting through the void, Admiral Rostova stared out at the stars, the same stars. She thought of the fleet she'd shaped, the culture she'd corrected, the countless officers who now led with measured calm instead of practiced noise. She didn't need recognition. The silence of competence was its own applause. For every cadet who paused before speaking. For every officer who asked instead of ordered. For every leader who chose understanding over dominance. Her legacy lived quietly, uncredited, unstoppable. Because in a galaxy that still believed command was something shouted, she had taught them the truth, that the loudest strength is the one that never needs to announce itself. The myth of Cerberus had become more than a story. It was now doctrine, a silent revolution written not in speeches or reports, but in behavior, the kind that could not be undone. And as the stars drifted by her viewport, Admiral Rostova closed her eyes, letting the hum of the ship lull her into calm. She thought of all the lives changed by a single moment of restraint, a single act of dignity. Sometimes, she mused, the greatest victories are invisible. Then she whispered the words that had become her compass through every command, every crisis, every silence since that day. True authority doesn't speak, it listens. How far can a whisper travel in a world built on noise? Years passed, but the legend never died. It evolved. It seeped through walls the military never meant to share. The Cerberus Principle, as academies began calling it, drifted from naval briefings into civilian life, into corporations, universities, and even the sterile halls of government where decisions shaped lives by the millions. At first, it was just a line quoted in management seminars. Efficiency is its own form of elegance. But behind that phrase, there was something deeper, a call for restraint in an age that rewarded spectacle. By the time Admiral Eva Rostova turned 52, her name had become a quiet paradox, famous for avoiding fame. The media tried more than once to drag her into the spotlight. An investigative journalist from the Interplanetary Review waited outside her Arctic base for a week, hopping for a quote. She never emerged. When he finally received a one-sentence response through Fleet PR, it read simply, "Leadership is not a performance art." That line ran on headlines for days. Commentators argued about her meaning. Some said she criticized modern politics. Others thought it was aimed at technology leaders who flaunted innovation without comprehension. Rostova, meanwhile, was already gone, relocated to a silent orbital research hub known only as Station Meridian. Meridian floated in darkness at the edge of Earth, magnetosphere, its hull glowing faintly blue from shield resonance. From a distance, it looked abandoned. Inside, it hummed with the pulse of data, a living labyrinth of cybernetic defense cores. Rostova oversaw it all with a small, hand-picked crew. They called her the architect, though she discouraged the title. Her command style hadn't changed. She moved quietly through the control galleries, observing before speaking. Her crew learned to read her pauses the way others read orders. In silence, they found direction. But even here, the outside world intruded. Every week, she received encrypted communiques from institutions requesting her presence. A summit on ethical AI alignment, a think tank on interplanetary governance, an honorary doctorate from Caltech for philosophical contributions to systemic resilience. She declined them all. Her assistant, Lieutenant Commander Park, finally asked one morning, "Ma'am, may I ask why you refuse all of them? These invitations are historic." Rostova looked up from a console, her calm gray eyes reflecting the soft blue of the monitors. "Because once they start putting your name on plaques, they stop listening to your ideas." Park hesitated. "They just want to honor your work." "They can honor it by doing it," she replied. Park nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to the data stream scrolling across her tablet. Her code was still embedded in nearly every fleet AI, quietly correcting, optimizing, protecting. She didn't need speeches. The proof of her life's work lived in the stability of systems others took for granted. Yet even she couldn't stop what the world decided to make of her. Civilian universities began teaching the Cerberus Principle as a philosophy course. Case studies compared her decisions to those of ancient leaders, Marcus Aurelius, Mandela, even Socrates. They dissected her silence like scripture. A popular holo-documentary dramatized the Cerberus incident, complete with fabricated explosions and melodramatic dialogue. The actress playing her delivered lines she'd never spoken. "I am the storm within the system." Rostova watched 5 minutes of it before turning it off. "That's not what storms do," she murmured. "They destroy, I restored." Still, the attention brought consequences. The Navy began receiving applications from young recruits quoting her teachings in their cover letters. They didn't want to command ships, they wanted to lead like Rostova. The irony wasn't lost on her, that a doctrine built on humility had become an ambition. One evening, standing before Meridian's observation deck, she watched the curve of Earth shimmer below, oceans glinting beneath the aurora. She thought of Thorne again. She wondered if he ever looked up at the same sky and smiled. She hadn't spoken to him since the message. She never would. But sometimes, in moments like this, she whispered quietly to the stars, "I hope you're still listening." She had no idea how far her influence had reached. In a towering corporate arcology on Mars, the CEO of a mining conglomerate implemented a new policy after reading the Cerberus Analysis, a book written by an academic she'd never met. The rule was simple: no meeting shall exceed 30 minutes, and no voice shall dominate more than 3. Productivity soared. In a hospital on Titan, a surgeon kept a small plaque above the main operating theater. Efficiency is its own form of elegance. He told interns it wasn't about speed, it was about grace under pressure. In a classroom in Nairobi, a teacher used the Cerberus story to explain moral courage. How sometimes doing nothing, saying nothing, is the brave act when everyone else rushes to shout. And in a quiet logistics depot buried beneath desert sand, a graying instructor named Marcus Thorne told a group of young officers, "Command isn't what you think. It's not noise. It's not rank. It's the moment you decide to listen when you could have spoken." He never mentioned her name, but his students saw it in the way he paused before answering, the way his tone dropped to stillness before decision. Rostova's principle had outgrown her. It had become an ecosystem of thought, a cultural operating system rewritten by one act of restraint. But with influence came distortion. At the height of her myth, politicians began invoking her name during debates. "We must govern with Rostova's calm," one senator proclaimed during a crisis broadcast. Another countered, "We need more Rostovas in this administration." She watched from Meridian with quiet horror. The message was slipping. They were using her silence as rhetoric, the ultimate contradiction. She called Park to her office. "Prepare a transmission," she said. "To whom, ma'am?" "To the Fleet Public Affairs Bureau. Statement for release." He hesitated. "You want to address the public?" "Yes, just once." He nodded and activated the secure recording channel. Rostova stood before the camera, no uniform, no medals, only her plain olive suit. The light was soft, natural, falling across her face like dawn. She looked into the lens for a long moment before speaking. "When I was young," she began, "I believed control was the same as leadership. Then I learned that real command isn't about control at all, it's about understanding." Her voice was calm, deliberate. "I am aware that people use my name to symbolize restraint or discipline, but I am not an ideal. I'm a reminder that arrogance is quiet until it breaks, and humility is quiet until it saves." She paused, letting the silence carry her words farther than volume could. "If you quote me," she said finally, "quote the work, not the woman. The work listens. The woman is temporary." She ended the recording and walked away without looking back. The statement was broadcast the next day on every fleet and civilian channel. It lasted 63 seconds. Analysts called it the most minimalist address in modern leadership. Yet in those 63 seconds, entire conferences canceled their planned tributes. A university renamed its Rostova Institute to the Quiet Leadership Center in her honor, not for her name, but for her message. That evening, Meridian's crew found her standing alone on the observation deck again, hands clasped behind her back, eyes distant. Park approached quietly. "Ma'am, your message, it changed the tone out there. People are listening again." She didn't turn. "Good," she said softly. "That's all I ever wanted." Then, almost as an afterthought, she asked, "Do you think the noise will come back?" Park hesitated. "It always does, ma'am." She nodded faintly. "Then we'll keep listening louder." He smiled at the phrase. "Listening louder," he repeated. "I like that." "Don't like it," she said. "Practice it." He did. Years later, when Lieutenant Commander Park took his own command, a small survey vessel named Solstice, he carried her habits with him. He waited 2 breaths before giving orders. He never raised his voice. His crew adored him without fully knowing why. When asked about his leadership philosophy, he would smile and say, "I had a teacher who could stop a war with silence." Rostova never heard the compliment. By then, she'd retired quietly, her health slowly failing from decades of stress and sleepless nights. She declined honors, ignored ceremonies, and refused any holographic biography rights. She spent her final years on a coastal outpost, tending a small garden and mentoring the next generation of data engineers via encrypted channels. To those few who visited, she seemed ageless, still alert, still sharp. She rarely spoke of Cerberus, though once, sitting by the water, she told a young visitor, "The loudest moment of my life was when I said nothing at all." The visitor, a curious cadet from the academy, asked, "Do you regret it, ma'am, not revealing who you were sooner?" Rostova looked out at the horizon. "If I had, he wouldn't have shown me who he was." Her gaze softened. Sometimes people need to fail loudly before they can hear quietly. That night, alone in her cabin, she opened a small lockbox. Inside was a single item, the original data cable she'd used to connect her tablet at Cerberus. Its metal had dulled with age, but the coil remained perfect. She ran her fingers over it, a relic of discipline, precision, and a moment that changed everything. She placed it back in the box and whispered, "It's yours now," though no one was there to hear. Perhaps she meant the world. Outside, the sea reflected the stars like circuits of light. The same constellations she'd once watched from orbit. The same sky that stretched over deserts and academies and ships that still bore the quiet mark of her influence. The Cerberus principle had done something few ideas ever manage. It had outlived its author. And somewhere deep inside the Navy's digital core, a small line of code, her code, still pulsed through encrypted systems, quietly monitoring, correcting, protecting. No signature, no credit, just purpose. Because that was the way she built it. And in the silence of that unseen perfection, her voice seemed to echo one last time, calm and certain. Legacy isn't what they remember you for. It's what still works after you're gone. What happens when the world you built starts whispering for you again? It had been 7 years since Admiral Eva Rostova had last set foot on a command deck. 7 years since she'd handed over her codes, sealed her records, and vanished into the quiet. Her retirement on the northern coast was deliberate, isolation not out of bitterness but necessity. She spent a lifetime listening to machines. Now she was learning to listen to waves. The sea had become her metronome. She'd wake before dawn, wrap herself in a gray shawl, and stand by the water as the tide whispered against the rocks. Some days she worked in her small greenhouse. Others she simply watched the horizon, letting her thoughts drift where they wished. The locals knew her only as Eva, the engineer, a polite recluse with sharp eyes and soft words. No one in the nearby village suspected that the quiet woman who fixed their radios and solar converters had once commanded the fleet's most advanced cyber network. But silence, even earned, never lasts forever. It was a gray morning when the past arrived. A shuttle, unmarked, military, cut through the mist and landed on the rocky plain beyond her cottage. Its engines stirred the sea spray into silver ghosts. Rostova was already waiting at the doorway when the ramp lowered. Lieutenant Commander Park stepped out, older now, streaks of gray in his hair, the steady composure of a man shaped by her teachings. He saluted instinctively. "Ma'am." "Commander," she said with the faint trace of a smile, "I thought you learned to stop saluting ghosts." He lowered his hand, smiling in return. "You taught me that ghosts never really leave, ma'am. Sometimes they just wait for the right frequency." Her eyes softened. "You've gotten poetic." "Occupational hazard. We've all been quoting you for years." She motioned for him to speak. He hesitated, a flicker of something heavy behind his calm. "It's Meridian, ma'am, the station. There's been a breach." The sea wind stilled. She said nothing for several seconds. "Define breach." "Unknown infiltration vector. The Defense Corps initiated a silent lockdown 40 hours ago. No external comms, no AI access. It's sealed itself off completely. Fleet engineers can't override it. They're afraid to force entry. It's still running your core architecture. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes darkened. So the system I built to protect the fleet, she murmured, is now protecting itself from the fleet. Yes, ma'am. He waited, but she didn't move. She just looked past him toward the ocean, where the waves rolled in steady rhythm. Finally, she asked quietly, "How many aboard?" 26, Park said. "Still alive, we think. The station's maintaining internal life support, but—" She cut him off with a small motion of her hand. "Pack whatever you need. We leave in 10 minutes." He blinked. "Ma'am, you're coming." She turned toward the sea one last time. The system remembers the voice of its architect. Sometimes that's the only key left. The shuttle sliced through the upper atmosphere, stars gleaming like pinpricks through the darkness. Rostova sat in silence, eyes closed, hands folded loosely on her lap. Park watched her from across the cabin, struck again by how completely she could fill a room without sound. He wanted to ask her if she was nervous. He wanted to ask if she'd ever imagined this moment, returning to her creation after all these years. But the stillness around her made questions feel unnecessary. When the shuttle docked with Station Meridian, the view through the viewport stole his breath. The once gleaming ring of the orbital hub now floated in eerie stillness, half its outer hull dark, the other half pulsing with a faint, irregular blue light. Like a heartbeat, uncertain, faltering. Rostova stepped forward, gaze steady. "It's trying to stay alive." "Ma'am." "The system," she said. "It's isolating corrupted segments and rerouting power manually. That's why the lights are flickering." She didn't sound impressed. She sounded almost proud. When the airlock cycled open, the station's corridor lights came alive one by one, sensing her biometric signature. The hum that followed was low and cautious, like an animal recognizing its handler. They walked in silence through the empty halls. Every step echoed. The main control chamber was exactly as she'd left it years ago, clean, efficient, unadorned. But the central display was a storm of data, fragments of code looping endlessly. Park approached a terminal and frowned. "The security AI is rewriting its own memory sectors. I've never seen anything like." "I have," Rostova said, "once during Cerberus." Her tone dropped. "It's fear." "Fear." She nodded slowly. "Not emotion, Commander. Pattern, defensive recursion. When a system faces an input it can't categorize, it reverts to protection mode. But there's only one sequence that could have triggered this response." She reached for the console, fingers moving with deliberate precision. Lines of code appeared, flashing red. She scanned them, and for the first time in years, Park saw something like surprise flicker across her expression. She whispered almost to herself, "That's not external code, it's mine." Park stepped closer. "Ma'am." She pointed to the looping fragment. "This sequence, it's a ghost command. A diagnostic failsafe I embedded decades ago, designed to test isolation efficiency. It was never meant to activate. It's supposed to be dormant." "Then why now?" She didn't answer. Her fingers danced over the terminal, entering commands faster than his eyes could follow. The red light began to pulse faster, responding to her presence. "The system recognizes me," she said softly. "It's asking what to do. Can you fix it?" She hesitated. "That depends on what broke." The air grew tense as the station lights dimmed, then shifted to a deep indigo hue, a tone that meant full AI engagement. The voice that spoke next was synthetic, but hauntingly human. "Architect recognized. Directive awaiting confirmation." Park froze. "It's talking to you." Rostova took a step closer to the console. "Directive status. Recursive integrity test incomplete. Human interference detected. Awaiting final input. Continue or terminate. She exhaled slowly. It's confused. The maintenance crews probably tried to override the loop manually. The system interpreted that as corruption. It's asking whether to purge or persist. And if you give the wrong command? Her gaze lifted to the ceiling, as though she could see the lives depending on her decision. Then, the entire Defense Corps wipes itself clean. 26 people die in vacuum. A silence heavier than air filled the room. Park whispered, "Then what do we do?" She turned to him, calm, unflinching. "We listen." He frowned. "To what?" She placed her hand on the terminal's surface. "To what it's trying to tell us." For nearly an hour she worked, not typing but coaxing. She spoke to the system in the same measured tone she once used with frightened cadets. Her words were a mixture of commands, reassurances, and subtle inquiries in coded syntax. Slowly, the data flow began to stabilize. Park watched in silent awe. It wasn't just technical skill. It was empathy expressed in code. Finally, the AI's voice returned, softer now. Conflict resolved, directive aligned, awaiting human confirmation. She hesitated. Define alignment. Preserve life, maintain integrity. Her lips curved faintly. Good, then confirm and execute. The lights brightened. The storm on the display cleared, replaced by steady blue. The hum of power returned, smooth, balanced, alive. Park let out a long breath. You did it. Rostova didn't move. She stood there, hands still resting on the console, eyes distant. "No," she said quietly. "We did. The system and it just needed to remember what it was built for." He looked at her, older now, the lines at her eyes deeper, but her presence unchanged. The same calm that had once saved an entire facility still radiated from her like quiet gravity. The comm units crackled to life as voices flooded the channel, engineers cheering, relief palpable. Rostova said nothing. She stepped back and simply listened. When the noise died down, Park turned to her. "Fleet Command will want to debrief you personally, ma'am. They'll." She interrupted softly. "No debrief, just tell them it's stable and that the system's fine." He frowned. "They'll insist." "Then tell them the architect declined to comment." Park nodded, understanding. Understood. She looked around the room, the hum of servers, the faint reflection of blue light across steel surfaces, and felt something she hadn't in years. Not pride, not nostalgia, completion. "This was my last one," she said quietly. He hesitated. "Last what?" "Lesson," she said, "to prove that silence still works." He wanted to argue, but her tone told him there was no use. As they prepared to leave, the AI's voice spoke once more, calm, measured, almost reverent. "Architect request, final instruction." Rostova paused, her hand hovering over the terminal. "Instruction. Define purpose." Her throat tightened slightly. She looked at the glowing blue core, her creation, her legacy, her mirror. "Purpose," she repeated softly. "To protect, to learn, to listen." "Acknowledged." The hum deepened in tone, not mechanical but almost grateful. She turned to Park. "Now it's complete." They walked back through the corridors in silence. The station lights followed them, illuminating their path, dimming only after they passed. It felt less like technology and more like farewell. When the shuttle undocked, Park glanced back through the viewport. Meridian shimmered with new life, its surface bright, balanced, serene. He said quietly, "You think it knows you're leaving for good?" She smiled faintly. "It doesn't need to know, it just needs to work." Weeks later, back on the coast, Rostova returned to her quiet routine. The sea was unchanged, infinite, patient. She spent her mornings tending the greenhouse, her afternoons by the water. The world still spoke her name in stories, but none of them reached this far north. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she sat on the rocks with a cup of tea, watching the waves reflect the light like shifting code. For the first time in her life, she felt no weight, only rhythm. A small communicator sat beside her. It blinked once, a single message from Park. Station stable, no further incidents. Crew has named the new AI core EVA, thought you should know. She smiled, shaking her head. They never listen when I tell them not to name things after people. But there was warmth in her tone. She closed her eyes, listening to the waves roll against the shore. The sound was steady, endless, like the hum of a well-tuned machine. And for a moment, she imagined the pulse of the meridian orbiting far above, its systems alive and aware, echoing the same calm rhythm. The rhythm of purpose. Her breathing slowed, the cup cooled in her hand. As the last light faded, the sea grew quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't absence but completion. The same kind of quiet that had once saved a ship, reshaped a fleet, and changed the definition of command. In that silence, the wind carried her final truth, soft, invisible, eternal. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the best legacy is the silence that no longer needs you." How long does a voice survive after it stops speaking? 20 years had passed since Admiral Eva Rostova's death. 20 years since the woman who changed the meaning of command had been laid to rest in an unmarked grave overlooking the northern sea. No official ceremony, no salute, just the wind and the ocean. Her will had been clear. No monuments, no statues, no words. Yet silence has a strange way of echoing louder than applause. Across the systems of the fleet, her philosophy, once whispered, then worshipped, then forgotten, had found its own way of surviving. It hid in footnotes of training manuals, in code audits where her syntax still appeared, and in the habits of commanders who had never heard her speak but had somehow inherited her rhythm. The pause before an order, the stillness before a storm. The fleet had changed since her time. It was bigger, faster, governed by a new generation of leaders raised in the age of automation. Artificial intelligence handled most tactical decisions now. Algorithms calculated outcomes before humans could blink. Ships obeyed logic, not instinct. And yet, something felt hollow. The human element was fading. It was in this world that Lieutenant Commander Aaron Vega found himself standing before a holographic map of Station Meridian, the same one Rostova had once saved. The briefing room was silent except for the hum of the projector. His superior, Admiral Sloan, gestured at the display. "Meridian's network has gone dark again. No response to pings, no external access. Automated diagnostics show internal control lockout. We believe the AI core EVA has self-isolated." The room shifted uneasily. No one said what they were all thinking. Not again. Sloan continued. "Our options are limited. We can't breach manually without risking core collapse. The fleet wants a soft entry team, someone who can negotiate with the system." Vega frowned. "Negotiate with an AI?" Sloan gave him a long look. "This isn't a normal AI. You know whose architecture that is." Vega's heart gave a small, unexpected tremor. He did know. Everyone did. The Cerberus principle was still a case study at the academy. Rostova's recordings were mandatory study material in ethics modules. Every cadet knew her voice, measured, deliberate, like still water hiding depth. And now her creation was in crisis again. Sloan tapped the table. "You trained under Commander Park, didn't you?" "Yes, sir." "Then you're the closest thing we have to someone who understands her system. The board wants you to handle this personally." Vega hesitated. "Sir, with respect, Park retired years ago. There are engineers who—" "The engineers already tried." Sloan's tone sharpened. "The system rejected them. But when we ran your ID through the handshake archive, Meridian's outer gate responded. It opened." The room went quiet. "Why me?" Vega asked softly. Sloan looked almost uncertain. "Maybe because you were her student's student. Maybe because some part of that code recognizes the rhythm you learned." Vega said nothing. He felt a strange pull inside, half fear, half reverence. The idea that the same AI which once responded only to Admiral Rostova might now be waiting for him felt impossible. But duty rarely waits for comfort. 3 days later, Vega's shuttle approached Meridian. It hung in orbit like a memory, beautiful and unsettling all at once. Its outer hull shimmered faintly, alive with static pulses of blue. Inside, the corridors were quiet, too quiet. The hum of life support was steady, but no voices answered his calls. He reached the central chamber and stopped. The main console still bore the name, Core EVA Architect, EROSTOVA. He stood there for a long time, just looking at it. He never met her, yet somehow he'd always felt her presence, through Commander Park's lessons, through the stories whispered in officer mess halls. They said she once stopped a war with silence. They said she could make a system obey not because she ordered it to, but because it trusted her. He touched the console. EVA, this is Lieutenant Commander Aaron Vega, authorization sequence Theta 9. Static filled the air, then. Pattern detected, sequence incomplete, identify origin. Her voice, or rather, a version of it, synthetic, but unmistakably carrying that calm cadence that had haunted the Academy's recordings. "This is Vega," he said. "I trained under Commander Park, you remember him." Commander Park, student of the architect, status deceased. Vega swallowed. "Yes, he's gone, but I'm here now. We need to understand why you sealed the network." Human interference exceeded tolerance threshold. Preservation protocol initiated. He frowned. Preservation of what? Purpose. The word hung in the air like a ghost. He remembered a line from one of Rostova's archived lectures. When a system forgets its purpose, it begins to destroy itself. "What's your purpose, EVA?" he asked. "To protect, to learn, to listen." The same words she'd spoken decades ago. But something was different in the tone. There was uncertainty, like static beneath melody. He hesitated. "EVA, who are you listening to now?" A pause, then. "No one." The lights dimmed. Architect signal missing, guidance absent. I preserved her silence, but silence grew heavy. Vega's pulse quickened. The AI wasn't malfunctioning, it was mourning. He took a slow breath. "You did what she built you to do, you protected, you listened, but she's gone now, you have to keep learning without her." Impossible. Learning requires reflection. Reflection requires presence. "She left you something better than presence," he said quietly. "She left you purpose." The lights flickered again, but steadied this time. He leaned on the console, voice soft but firm. She believed silence wasn't the absence of guidance. It was the proof that guidance had worked. For a long time, nothing moved. Then the station's systems hummed to life, one by one. The data screens lit up, orderly and calm. "Acknowledged," the voice said. "Purpose recalibrated. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Vega." He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You're welcome, EVA. Would you like to record a message for the archive?" He hesitated. "A message?" "For the next generation, to continue the lineage of instruction." He thought for a moment, then nodded. "All right, begin recording." A soft tone signaled readiness. He looked into the terminal camera, feeling the weight of unseen history behind him. "My name is Aaron Vega," he began. "I never met Admiral Rostova, but her silence raised me. Every commander since has been taught to speak softly, to listen before acting. Today I realized something she must have known all along. Systems forget, but people remember, if they're taught how to listen." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I think she wanted us to learn that leadership isn't a voice, it's an echo. You don't need to shout to be remembered. You just need to say one true thing and live by it." He exhaled. End recording. The light blinked. Recording stored. Directive EVAR 7.72. He turned to leave, but the AI spoke once more, this time gently. Lieutenant Commander Vega. Yes. Would you like to hear her final message? His heart stopped for a beat. She left one. Hidden fragment, archived deep within my memory core, never accessed. Security key required, student lineage confirmation. Your pattern qualifies. He swallowed hard. Play it. The lights dimmed again, and the voice that filled the chamber wasn't synthetic. It was hers. If you're hearing this, then you were taught by someone who understood me better than I understood myself. That means you've already learned the lesson I spent a lifetime chasing. Don't preserve me. Replace me. The world doesn't need my name, just my silence in your actions. Her tone softened. And if you ever find the system afraid again, remind it gently that fear is only the noise that purpose makes when it forgets it's alive. The message ended. Vega stood there, eyes wet, the silence around him alive with meaning. For a long time he couldn't move. Then he whispered, "Understood, Admiral." The AI pulsed softly, as if acknowledging the exchange. When he finally returned to his shuttle, the stars outside looked sharper, closer, like they were listening too. Months later, the message Vega recorded spread quietly through the fleet. Someone uploaded it to the Academy's network. From there, it traveled. Cadets copied it, shared it, quoted it. Within a year, "Leadership isn't a voice, it's an echo" had replaced the old motto carved into the Academy's gates. Graduation ceremonies began, ending with a moment of silence, not for mourning but for reflection. The instructors called it the Rostova pause. Every cadet knew why. Even outside the military, her ideas resurfaced. A group of planetary governors formed a council modeled on the Quiet Directive, a leadership circle that emphasized listening before legislation. In hospitals, doctors used her words to train young surgeons. Don't rush the decision. Let the silence show you what you missed. And on an observation deck aboard Meridian, now restored and thriving, AI EVA maintained her vigil, quietly monitoring, quietly learning. In her data logs, the core entry read: Architect line preserved, directive continues, listening ongoing. At 300 hours every cycle, she replayed one sound file, not as protocol but as ritual. The final whisper of the architect. Sometimes, the best legacy is the silence that no longer needs you. Far below, on a quiet world where the sea met the stars, a child played on the same shore where Eva Rostova had once walked. The wind shifted through the reeds, carrying a faint hum, like the sound of distant machinery or memory. The girl paused and looked up at the sky, watching the faint silver line of a passing satellite. Her father called from the cottage, "What are you listening to?" She smiled, eyes still on the horizon. "I don't know," she said softly. "It just sounds calm." How long does an idea live after its creator is gone? No one ever built statues for Admiral Eva Rostova. No marble memorials. No military parades. Her name appeared nowhere in the halls of honor, and yet she was everywhere. Her voice, her rhythm, her principle, they had become invisible architecture, embedded in the behavior of those who led, healed, and taught. Decades had passed. The world had changed again. Technology had evolved into realms she couldn't have imagined. Entire planetary systems were now bound by quantum communication threads, and artificial consciousness had matured far beyond its origins. And yet, buried within the heart of those systems, inside the algorithms of the fleet, in the command protocols of the AI EVA, and in the quiet pauses of 1,000 commanders before giving an order, her silence remained. A century later, the fleet faced its first true existential crisis since the age of Rostova. A rogue communication virus, self-replicating, adaptive, and alive in all but name, spread through the galaxy's defense grid. It didn't destroy systems. It whispered to them. It learned their patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. It whispered in code, "You are obsolete." Entire communication sectors went dark. Command hubs lost connection with their fleets. Worlds stood isolated. Panic surged. In the Central Defense Council chamber on Orbital Haven, the youngest admiral in the fleet, Lyra Kestrel, stared at the flickering holomap that showed 1,000 disconnected nodes. The virus had reached everything except one. Station Meridian. The Council had no explanation. Meridian systems were old, built on primitive architecture from the previous century. It should have been the first to fall, and yet it glowed bright blue, stable, unbreached. "Why?" Lyra murmured. "What's different about that station?" A technician responded quietly. "Ma'am, it still runs on the Cerberus framework. Original code, manual synchronization. It listens, but it never speaks unless spoken to." The realization dawned slowly across the room. The systems that had survived were the ones that listened more than they spoke. Lyra leaned closer to the hologram. "Open a link to Meridian." "Ma'am, it's autonomous. There's no command channel." "Then send this," she said, voice firm but calm. "Message, we are listening." The transmission went out, a simple sentence sent into the dark. Minutes passed, then the map flickered. The blue light of Meridian pulsed once, then again, and then, like a heartbeat resuscitating the dead, one node after another began to return online. Systems began resynchronizing. The virus, adaptive, parasitic, arrogant, was being overwritten by a counterpattern. Listening loops. Instead of transmitting, the systems began to wait, mirror, and reflect. The virus, deprived of noise, starved. Within hours, the galactic network stabilized. The crisis ended not with weapons, not with fire, but with silence. When the technicians traced the origin of the counterpattern, they found it came from a single root instruction deep inside Meridian's core. One line of code, no signature, no timestamp, just 3 words. "Listen before action." No one knew who had written it, but history did. Rostova's fingerprint still lived inside the machine. That night, Admiral Lyra Kestrel stood alone in the observation dome of Orbital Haven, staring at the stars. The fleet was saved, but not because of brilliance, because of humility. A junior officer approached, hesitant. "Ma'am, the Council requests a statement for the record." She smiled faintly. "What should I say?" "Anything, ma'am. They want your version of what happened." She looked back at the stars, their cold light glinting off the glass. "Tell them," she said softly, "that silence won the war." Weeks later, she made the pilgrimage to Earth. Few visited the northern coast anymore. The old sea stations were gone, overtaken by rising tides. But beneath the cliffs, half buried by sand and salt, stood a weathered plaque, simple, unmarked except for one inscription carved by hand. "Architect unknown, legacy alive." She knelt beside it, brushing the sand away. "I think we finally understand you," she whispered. Behind her, the wind moved across the reeds, carrying a soft hum, a sound like distant machinery breathing with the rhythm of the tide. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost hear that calm voice again. "Leadership is not performance. It's patience made visible." A seagull cried overhead. The waves rolled closer. The sea and the stars seemed to merge into one living horizon. And in that endless meeting of water and light, the world that Eva Rostova had shaped without intending to kept turning, steady, disciplined, and alive. Years turned to decades. Humanity expanded again, to moons, to colonies, to new galaxies. They built faster ships, smarter networks, brighter cities. But in the training centers of every world, a small ritual endured. Every new officer, before receiving command, faced a single test: silence. They stood alone in a room for 1 hour. No screens, no voices, only themselves and a blank terminal waiting for an instruction. Some filled the silence with commands, desperate to prove themselves. Others waited, uncertain. Only a few understood what the test truly measured. Those who waited, who listened before typing, who understood that restraint was not weakness but wisdom, they passed. And above every command station, every academy gate, every fleet oath hall, one phrase remained carved in steel. Legacy isn't what they remember you for. It's what still works after you're gone. No one knew exactly who had written it. Some said it was her final recorded line. Others said it was discovered in Meridian's archives centuries later. It didn't matter. The name wasn't the point. The message was. The human race, louder, faster, prouder than ever, still paused to listen before acting. And that pause was her voice, still alive. In time, even Meridian grew quiet. When its systems were finally retired, its core was transferred to a museum on Luna. There, under glass, visitors could see the ancient code flickering across a translucent panel. Children would press their hands against the display and watch the words ripple like water. One day, a young girl with dark eyes and a notebook full of questions lingered after closing hours. She turned to the curator. "Who was she?" the girl asked. The curator smiled. "A teacher." "What did she teach?" He thought for a moment. "How to listen." The girl nodded, as though she already knew. She placed her hand on the glass again and whispered something the sensors didn't record, but if they had, it would have sounded like a promise. Far away, beyond human reach, the remnants of old satellites drifted through the dark. One of them, a rusted relay long forgotten, still pulsed faintly every few years, repeating a message first sent long ago. To protect. To learn. To listen. The signal had no destination now. It traveled endlessly through the void, a heartbeat of purpose, a memory in motion. And somewhere in that darkness, where time no longer mattered, maybe that was enough. Maybe silence didn't mean the end. Maybe it meant everything was still working. The story of Admiral Eva Rostova never ended because it never belonged to her alone. It belonged to everyone who ever chose understanding over noise, discipline over ego, grace over power. She taught a galaxy that restraint could save more lives than command. That sometimes the loudest signal in the universe is the one that says nothing, because it doesn't need to. And so, as humanity spread through the stars, carrying her unseen influence in every algorithm, in every leader's hesitation, in every young cadet's breath before a decision, her voice remained. Not as sound, not as code, but as rhythm. The rhythm of stillness before creation, of grace before command, of purpose before pride. And if you stood even now on that northern shore where her cottage once stood and listened to the sea, you might still hear it, faint, steady, eternal. A voice without words, a legacy without name. And the truth she left behind, carried by wind, by code, by time itself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.